Welcome back. Hope you had an enjoyable lunch. We are now on to item 12, which sort of has number 17 piggyback on the back of it. I'd just like to ask Helen White to explain the difference to councillors between items 12 and 17, please.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. So item 12 is the approval to notify the two plan changes, and that is the decision which will be made first. Once that is made, then effectively item 17 is a tidying up, if you like, revoking what resolutions are superfluous following the actual approval of the notified plans to be notified. My apologies.
Assuming that that's the decision that
that is the decision council makes. It may well be that some of those resolutions in the revocations report may need to change depending on the council decision. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll now ask Mark and Ike to present their report, and good to see you up there as well, John.
Thank you very much. We'll give a brief overview of the context, the process, and then open it to questions. So in broader terms, what we're seeking to achieve as a council is a more compact and consolidated urban form. That's implemented by way of Plan Change 14 to give effect to the government's direction on intensification, and is aligned with the direction being taken in the context of Greater Christchurch and the spatial planning at that level, but also in our own spatial planning through the Ōtautahi Christchurch Plan. Whilst not before you, the Ōtautahi Christchurch Plan will also provide means by which we can better consider the impacts of intensification and how we create more livable environments. There is a need to grow up in the urban area of Christchurch to enable intensification rather than continuing to grow out. We've had direction from central government of the need to protect highly productive soils, but even without that direction, there are significant benefits for the city of a more compact form in providing accessibility to public transport, more efficient use of infrastructure, and an enhanced environment. The plan change does recognise differences within the urban area and provides for greatest heights in our city centre, with gradually reducing heights from our largest centres through to our smallest centres and the surrounds. So just briefly in terms of the story so far, 2020 the government released its National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which requires the council to make changes to its district plan to enable intensification. In 2021, that was followed by a cross-party agreement with Parliament amending the Resource Management Act. And in doing so, it amended the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, but also, importantly, introduced medium density residential standards, which we know as 3x3 of 3 houses per site up to 3 stories. It also introduced through that change a special process for the plan change, and we can talk to that further. Thereafter, in May 2022, the government then gave direction to councils that decisions on that special process had to be made by August 2023, and thereafter, September, the council received a report to notify that plan change, and we've subsequently had an investigation with Mr. John Hardy, who will speak to you later. We're now before you to present a revised proposal that seeks to balance the concerns you've heard through deputations, but also recognising that anything we put forward needs to be supported by evidence and meet the statutory requirements. We're not immune to the requirements of the legislation, and what is put forward to you is in accordance with that. I'll hand over to Ike now, who's going to just give an overview of the what we have to change in our district plan and where we've got discretion.
Kia ora koutou katoa, Mayor and Councillors. So, as you may very well be aware, the two fundamental aspects that we're required to give effect to through the intensification plan change are the medium density residential standards, known as MDRS, and the requirements under the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, otherwise known as NPSUD. MDRS provides for the framework of enabling 3 houses per site up to about 3 stories tall or 12 metres, along with a number of other density standards such as recession plane setbacks and site coverage and such as well. The NPSUD sets a level of intensification beyond what is set as the baseline through MDRS by focusing greater heights within and around commercial centres, largely based on the commensurate degree of what is provided within those centres. There's a minimum of at least 6 stories that must be enabled within at least a walkable catchment from the central city, as well as other commercial centres as well. We have limited discretion of what we are able to influence because of the directiveness of the legislation. We are able to influence through evidence the extent of walkable catchments and where they are applied, the density and height limits as well in response to the evidence of the level of commensurate activities within all those centres as well. And I guess most importantly, the qualifying matters that we also introduce where it is inappropriate to achieve the prescribed density outcome. Evidence is required for any qualifying matters that we are proposing as part of the intensification plan change, which I'll address in a moment. Fundamentally, and from a zoning perspective for residential and commercial aspects, we are broadly amalgamating the urban residential zones into 2 zones, being medium and high density zones, again giving effect to the baseline of MDRS setting that medium density outcome. A future urban zone is also introduced to cover off what is known as the residential new neighbourhood zone, which largely covers off our greenfield areas, and that is by function of national planning standards. In terms of those additional heights beyond the baseline of MDRS through the NPSUD, we have a variety of different heights based on the different centres that are there. So in the immediate surrounds around the central city, we have 32 metres or about 10 stories being enabled via resource consent for residential development. Around larger centres, 20 metres or about 6 stories is enabled at various extents, and around medium-sized centres, 14 metres, about 4 or 5 stories, is enabled as well via consent. Smaller centres remain at MDRS being 12 metres. From the commercial side of things, there is a fairly substantive change to the central city as a product of the NPSUD, again requiring us to intensify maximum development capacity as was practical within the central city. So whereas the current heights is in the order of 30 odd metres, depending on where you are in the central city, that is proposed to increase to 90 metres. That has to be achieved via resource consent. It's not a permitted level, and so as a consent process to achieve that as well. There are various other subsets within the central city, most notably Victoria Street and around Cathedral Square, as well as around the Arts Centre as a modified height as well, responding to qualifying matters that we have there as well. Within those larger town centres, being Papanui, Hornby and Riccarton, 22 metres is enabled within those centres, and then those other smaller centres have a height which is commensurate with their surrounds or residential surrounds of 20, 14 and 12 metres respectively as well. There is also a large area of rezoning of the current industrial area, most notably between the likes of Addington and near Phillipstown, largely centred in the Sydenham area, and that is proposed to rezone that area as a mixed use zone, more or less enabling 6 stories in height throughout that area. So from a visual perspective, these are the various different heights that we are enabling or proposing to enable through Plan Change 14. Shown there obviously the central city being the highest and then cascading outwards from there as well for the various centres. In terms of qualifying matters, we have built upon the framework that was proposed and put forward to Council in September last year. So the qualifying matters that we list there are additional to those existing qualifying matters that we had proposed last year. So for example, the likes of character areas, heritage areas and the like still are retained, and this is additional to them. First and foremost, the first or most substantive qualifying matter that we've proposed to introduce seeks to reflect our unique characteristics in terms of sunlight access based on our latitude. And so we have proposed to have an alternative approach to recession planes other than that which otherwise be directed through MDRS, and better reflects the sunlight access at a more equitable level across the country. Second is really the public transport accessibility, which focuses on the accessibility to core bus routes and also the connectivity between larger employment centres, reflecting on that outcome that is directed through the NPSUD. So we have a core 5 bus routes and then about 4 other bus routes which connect other centres together, and as a result the full extent by which MDRS would otherwise be applied is reduced by about a third overall. And within those areas, largely a suburban density would be achieved, similar to what is provided in the current district plan. A tsunami management area has also been introduced, reflecting the latest advice that we've received through NIWA. Again, this is a suburban density, avoiding any unnecessary or inappropriate intensification within a hazardous area. As part of the review post the proposal in September last year, we've also looked at our ability to give effect to Policy 3, which directs that intensification response within and around the centres. And as a result of that, what has been provided as a qualifying matter is protecting open space, including the Otakaro Avon River corridor. The lens that is applied for that is publicly accessible open space. So the vast majority, if not almost its entirety, of the Avon River corridor is protected through this qualifying matter. There is only one site made up of 2 parcels on the corner of Harvey Terrace and Fitzgerald Ave, where we have proposed to enable a level of development, however that is less than the minimum that would otherwise be prescribed through the NPSUD, and that is only enabling up to 3 stories within that site. Again, that is a feature of the requirement to intensify within a walkable catchment of the central city only. There is no other intensification that would otherwise be enabled within the Otakaro Avon River corridor as part of this plan change. Next, as has been reflected earlier on the day as well, we have proposed additional controls for the Riccarton Bush area, reflecting the landscape heritage values of the area and also the ecological effects that intensification may have. This influences in the order of about 250 parcels, properties around the Riccarton Bush area. Most of those are proposed to be enabled to only 2 stories in height, and that cascades down to a few that are at 3 stories, and then beyond that goes to the 6 stories that is required to be intensified in response to the local centre that's there for Riccarton. Next, we have also introduced a residential industrial interface. This seeks to reduce the level of height that would otherwise be permitted in areas that are in immediate proximity to industrial areas, and that is to ensure that there is not an undue exposure of noise effects, and also ensures the ongoing viability of industrial operations within those sites as well. That is to a depth of about 40 metres, and we have sought external expert acoustic evidence to support this as well. Lastly, we have introduced a qualifying matter protecting our key transport corridors, which run down Riccarton Road and Papanui, the highest, most well-used public transport routes that there are. And effectively, this is seeking to control development along the front proportion of parcels to ensure future upgrades to better facilitate public transport down those corridors. It's important to reflect that while there is a substantive amount of intensification that is being enabled through the Plan Change 14 process, this does not mean that we aren't able to adjust in terms of infrastructure demand and the like. We are required under Local Government Act every 3 years to issue an infrastructure strategy which is reflective of the demand that we are anticipating, and this is par for the course in terms of updating infrastructure sufficiency to address intensification into the future. Alongside this, we do have a myriad of other tools to reflect the likes of managing stormwater and other water sufficiencies. So in 2022, there was two quite important bylaws that was introduced to ensure that we had the protections to enable development where there was sufficient supply for all three waters. And so this ensures that for any development going forward, we can make sure that stormwater runoff is appropriate considering developments there. And these controls are not diminished as a result of Plan Change 14. And so these controls have been in place for some time, even before 2022, and require usually the retention of stormwater on site or discharge to ground and alike. And as you can see there are other controls that we have through other pieces of legislation as well to adjust our infrastructure sufficiency response and alike throughout the process. We do this, as I said again, for several years and on a daily basis. In terms of the timing of MDRS, this is the beginning of the process. We are here before you to seek endorsement to publicly notify the plan change to begin the process to receive submissions on our proposal, and then from that will be tested our response to those submissions through an independent hearings panel, which subject to approval to notify will convene at the latter of this year. Under the Act, any area where there are no qualifying matters has immediate legal effect in terms of MDRS being able to enable 3 stories and 3 units per site without resource consent. However, as we are proposing as part of this alternative process to introduce a sunlight access qualifying matter across the entirety of urban residential areas, the proxy effect means that there is a deferred effect of immediate legal effect of MDRS until decisions are made at the end of the process. Now, Plan Change 14 isn't obviously the only plan change we're seeking to endorsement to notify. Plan Change 13 is seeking to address the heritage elements of the city. We are proposing as part of this to introduce protections for an additional 44 buildings and heritage items, 26 building interiors, and 11 new heritage areas are also introduced as part of this. All of these are qualifying matters and would diminish any intensification that would otherwise be enabled through Plan Change 14. Under the Act, heritage features or provisions such as this have immediate legal effect upon notification, and so that means that there is greater protections as soon as it is notified. And this goes through, worthwhile to note, a separate process to Plan Change 14 in terms of the ins and outs of that. And so we would be waiting on decisions on Plan Change 14 before going through the decision process on Plan Change 13 to avoid any future scenario variations and the like, and ensure there's consistency in terms of provisions between Plan Changes 13 and 14 going forward. I'll now hand over to John to cover off next items.
Yeah, so this first slide's about participation in the IHP. We are trying really hard to make the submission and hearing process a more publicly accessible process for submitters. Where there's going to be a friend a submitter service available, and that person can give guidance on the process and how to submit a scope of a submission. We're also in discussions with the Community Law Centre to provide, it's a sort of more enhanced service from the friend a submitter service, and they will be able to go a bit more in depth in terms of helping submitters and their submissions. We're also looking at an extended submission period. The normal period is 20 working days, so we're adding 10 working days on top of that to 30. Just give people a bit more time to prepare their submissions. Then just the final comment there is really where I started off as an inclusive process that supports submitters to present to the IHP. So we're really sort of looking at what we can do in that space. Helen mentioned this earlier, but there's a supplementary report to consider today as well, and that's revoking 5 of the 8 resolutions from the September 2022 meeting. That report includes the details for revocation of each of those 5 council resolutions. Some resolutions are action, but others couldn't be supported by staff, so they haven't been actioned. If council approves the notification today, it will be necessary to revoke those resolutions. So we'll consider those following PC14. This slide is just a bit of a timeline of the process from here. We're at the top, so 1 March 2023, and we're considering whether to notify the plan change. If it is, if that decision is to notify the plan change, then 17th March is the target date for formally notifying the plan change. Just to comment on that bullet point underneath about MDRS provisions taking immediate effect, except where qualifying matters apply. Obviously, there is the recession plan qualifying matter that will have the effect of delaying all the MDRS. 3 May is proposed for submissions closing. That's 30 working days after notification of the plan change. And then June, July for summary submissions and further submissions. And then October, November is the months that we're looking for to hold the actual hearings in front of the independent hearings panel. And if those recommendations that the hearings panel make come back to council for a decision, and we're estimated that to be around April 2024. I just wanted to, before I hand over to Mr. Hardy, who's going to come up and say a few words, I just wanted to reiterate some of the key points made today. Obviously, Ike and Mark have been through some of the changes that have come through in the revision of this plan change. And that's really improved where we were in September and taken on board some of the feedback that we were able to take on board. I won't labour the second point because Mr. Hardy will talk to this, but obviously if council doesn't notify the plan change, then there is an option for the government to notify that plan change. And that may not include all the enhancements that have been made to the plan change, such as the recession plan, the access to public transport, all those improvements that have been made. And Ike's already mentioned this, but once notified, that just starts a formal process where people can make submissions and an independent hearings panel considers those submissions and other evidence. So it's really start of a public consultation process. I just wanted to pick up on one last point before I hand over to Mr. Hardy, is around some of the concerns around the quality of intensification. And I just wanted to highlight that there are some other things that can happen outside of this PC14 process, and staff are working on the Otahi Christchurch plan, where that's getting looking at the sort of master planning of particular areas and things like that. We'll get into that level of detail. The urban forest plan, which you'll be aware of. There's urban design panels, which will be looking at some of these proposals and trying to enhance the quality of them. So there are things that the council can work on outside of this process to get better outcomes in terms of the quality of intensification that occurs. That was it from me. We were going to get Mr. Hardy to come up to the table now and talk about his role.
Hopefully, at least in this context, the last time I appear before you as a council, because today's D-Day, as I've always said. I'm here because the government appointed me, and the government appointed me because you breached your statutory obligations to notify that plan. Simple as that. and you gave your staff directions to go and re-look at it, and your staff have taken time to do that, but they've, on my understanding, I'm not in control of any of the content, but they've worked their butts off to get it to this point. And you should know as well, I think it's fair to say, my reporting date to the government has passed. In order for this to work, I had to get an extension, and I have an extension. It's really until after today, because the government was prepared, I think, by inference, to give you time to bring this back before you today to see if you are prepared to carry out your statutory obligations. And of course, I'm here today, and I've had the benefit of listening to those who've presented to you, and the presentations come in a variety of forms. And I think you know, I've had a lot of presentations to me at home on my computer, many, and they reflect what you would expect, the wide variety of views. And I simply have an answer to all of this. The place where people express those views is an independent hearings panel. It's really not for you in a way, because you're delegating that responsibility to others. Yes, it comes back to you. That's the place. Helen Broughton was speaking to you, and she got it. She was saying, this is what I'm going to say to an independent hearings panel. And John Hardy, owner of land, might well find himself wanting to make a submission to that independent hearings panel. That's the proper process. And improper process, at least in my view, is for people to come along and tell you that you should continue breaching your statutory duty. And they never use those words, they use other words. And then they said as well, one speaker, Mr. Wilson, said the sky won't be about to fall in if you don't recommend the notification today. Well, no, Mr. Wilson, you're entirely wrong. So the next part of what I say is I look at you collectively, is to any of you who today think you should not vote to notify this plan. And I don't know who you might be. I don't know if any of you are of that view. So forgive me if I make these comments and none of you are of that view. The first thing you know is that I am going to do a report to the government very quickly to tell the government to have another person come in and take over that statutory role, because you haven't done your job. And this is the first question that people should ask themselves: is the government likely to accept my advice? I don't know, but I'll tell you this legislation had cross-party support. This is not about just the Labour Party. This is legislation that is being put forward by National and Labour, and it was made clear to me at the time of my appointment that the government felt very committed to that cross-party purpose. I think it was the first time I was told it was the first time it had happened in many, many a year, where National and Labour got together and agreed something. So I say this: the chances of the government not accepting my recommendation, because I made clear all along what it is, I think are very slim. Now, the second thing that will happen is that you could say, well, okay, a person is appointed, in what form will they notify? We might be no worse off, because they might notify the very document that's before you today, which you will have decided not to notify. And again, I want to say to you, that's a very high risk. That's a very high risk option if you were to take it, because that independent person has got three options. Plan A is the one that was presented to you initially. Plan B is the one you've got now, and there is something in between. And in order to speed things up, there's a real possibility that that independent person might decide on the one that came before you in August last year. So by voting against this, even though it's not perfect, you will have put at risk everything that your officers have worked hard to achieve over the last 6 months. And it is over 6 months since you were supposed to have notified that. I don't want to say any more. I just thank you for the courtesy you've shown me. And I, again, thank the council staff for the courtesy they've shown me. I have never sought to tell you as a council what should be in this document. I'm simply there because you haven't carried out your statutory duty. Likewise, I made clear in the seminars, my job was not to go back and be a politician and tell the government and the opposition, if I can call them that they've been wrong in all of this. That's not my role. That's a political role, and I don't have that. I'm there to investigate and report on your failure, and I'm hoping when I start writing, which I will this week or early next week, that I'm going to tell the government that between us all, we have fixed the problem and the plan is to be notified.
Thank you. You finished?
We're finished now, so questions.
Thank you very much. No, thank you for that presentation. I would now like to move the officer recommendations as written in the agenda, with the inclusion of a fourth additional resolution, which is coming up on the screen now in front of you, that yellow one. Okay. Can you see it? Oh, okay. This additional resolution is to give us, as council, the opportunity to set out the views, issues and concerns that we have about this requirement. Mr Hardy is able to consider our views in his final report to the government, and this allows us to do this. I will welcome input from all councillors over the rest of this week and next. We need to make sure that we are clear to Mr Hardy about our views and the matters of concern our community have expressed. So with that, I ask for a seconder, and that's Kelly, so thank you very much. So now we will go on to questions of staff, and I had, I had Tyler, Mark, and then Sarah, and then Mel.
So who's... Mark, I think, is going first.
Mark, sorry? Yep.
Very good. Thank you, staff, for all your efforts that you've put into this. I just wanted to explore whether there had been any conversation with our regulators in Wellington as to whether any of the height restrictions that have been imposed with this were at all negotiable, that we could come up with a Christchurch height that would be better for our community. Was that explored or a possibility?
Yeah, I don't think there's been any conversations like that. We did have the opportunity to submit on the MPS and the legislation, and that was our opportunity to really raise the height issue.
Worth noting, I presented about what we must do and what we've got discretion around. The national policy statement is directive in terms of height in the city centre, within a walkable distance of the city centre and in other locations. We do have discretion around the height limits that are proposed within a walkable distance of, for instance, our town centres. Notwithstanding that, though, there is direction that we are to enable greater heights and density that is commensurate with the range of activities in our centres. And that naturally leads to a need to consider larger centres differently from smaller centres, and to enable greater heights and density around our larger centres and therefore smaller ones around our smaller centres. So that range is reflected in the proposal, but I would caution against how much discretion there is insofar as the underlying principle is that we must enable greater heights and density.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Tyler?
Kia ora. Can you talk to us about the process of submissions and hearings, and what the odds are if some submissions were evidence-based and they actually looked appropriate, what the odds are of actually getting that into a qualifying matter?
The basis of that is really set in the Act. So the Act stipulates what the requirements are to be met in terms of whether or not a feature is a qualifying matter. And so on the face of it, if a submission, like you say, were to be put forward, which is justified via evidence and would meet that criteria, then I don't see now the reason why that wouldn't be able to be considered as a qualifying matter.
Sure. And around the sunlight access QM, is that deferring all MDRS, or is it also in the city at the same time? I'm just trying to clarify.
Yeah, so under the Act, the immediate legal effect of MDRS is only the medium density residential standards.
Okay.
So the likes of commercial development was never enabled further in terms of immediate legal effect. And so applying a universal qualifying matter, if you will, like sunlight access, only defers residential, noting that there was no acceleration for commercial anyway. Effectively, the upshot is that the timing in terms of immediate legal effect is synchronised together with residential and commercial, which would all be ready when decisions are made.
That's 6 stories in their residential areas, correct?
Yeah, as well as others. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And
Just to clarify, the only provisions with immediate legal effect will be the Plan Change 13 heritage provisions.
Yes.
I'm talking. Yeah, I'm just trying to think from a Riccarton standpoint. Obviously, there's been a lot of advocacy for and against these residential zonings, and essentially there is going to be a lot of submissions coming from the Riccarton ward, particularly if this council chooses to notify. So I'm just wondering about the deferral of building, of development in Riccarton. Just to be clear, is everything in Riccarton going to be deferred until the hearings submissions are, or the period ends?
Yeah, correct. So the legal effect of those rules that are proposing 6 stories will not come into any effect until decisions are made by council on the recommendations of the independent hearings panel.
Cool, that's good to know. Cheers, guys. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah.
Kia ora, and thanks so much for the work over the last few months. It's been really full on. I've got a series of questions. First one, in our report in September 2022, we had advice that under the standards we had no discretion on recession planes, but here we are trying to put a qualifying matter in on recession planes. How does that advice align?
Yeah, I guess with the benefit of hindsight, the Act itself is quite directive in terms of when immediate legal effect arises. And under Section 86BA, it stipulates that if there isn't any area that is identified as a qualifying matter, then there is an immediate legal effect. And so the Act itself has not, I guess, anticipated such a response in terms of a universal qualifying matter. And so I guess by that nature, where the assumption that we took is that it really isn't that viable. I mean, once we came back and reflected on the outcome from September, I guess we looked at what options do we have to ensure that we can put forward a proposal where there is greater acceptance in terms of a more bespoke solution, if you will. And so we looked at what specific unique characteristics exist, because at the end of the day, the qualifying matter that is used for sunlight access has the highest evidence basis requirement because it's not a prescribed qualifying matter under the Act, which makes it quite difficult really to justify, hence the workload over the last few months. So in that respect, because the Act isn't really geared towards, again, a universal response, we hadn't taken that view. Again, looking at what unique characteristics there are, the latitude argument presented itself as an opportunity. And looking into that further, we saw that there was merit, both from a legal standpoint and from an evidence standpoint, to progress with a qualifying matter.
Okay. If the qualifying matter for sunlight ends up staying at the end of the process, that will limit development in some forms because people won't be able to build quite as much. Some 3 stories won't be able to go ahead, that kind of thing. Is that right?
Yeah, so from the testing that we've done, in the order of about 90% of what MDRS would otherwise enable is still achievable through the recession plan. So the recession plans that are set for through MDRS set a recession plane that is taken at 4 metres from the boundary at 60 degrees across all boundaries regardless of its orientation. What we have proposed is an orientated based approach, reflecting the importance of northern aspects, for example, and so there is a more aggressive angle that is set to protect that, and it's also taken a lower height. So for all recession planes across north, south, east, west are taken at 3 metres, and across the most aggressive they're taken at 50 degrees rather than 60, and then east, west are taken at 55, and then the southern at 60 degrees.
So the concern from many current property owners seems to be about the potential to not get sunlight in their living rooms within the house if something goes up next door. What's the different distance from the boundary? So for current homes that aren't close to the boundary, are they still likely to get it even with the normal, with the MDRS recession plane? Or, how close to the boundary would they have to be?
Sure, yeah. So a recession plane angle effectively acts as a proxy setback control. And so under the baseline MDRS control, the proxy setback, even though the setbacks on MDRS are 1 metre, you still need to abide by the recession plane angle. And so if you were to build 3 stories straight up, the proxy setback is actually about 2.4 metres under MDRS.
I'm talking about the existing properties. So if you're a neighbour and
yes,
someone
I'm just
puts one
explaining
up,
the setback that would be there.
Yeah,
so the setback that would be in effect through the recession plane that we would be setting means that in order of about 4 metres is the setback that's there. And so there is a far greater separation, if you will, between buildings for sunlight access.
So if someone's got an existing property and their house is 4 metres from the boundary, they are not likely to have their sunlight blocked out in their home under the
That entirely depends on the orientation of the property.
But yeah.
I mean, in terms of our testing, we've tested it based on an MDRS model because that is the baseline.
Okay. So we also had advice last time that the proposed plan change went kind of as far as staff thought it could without and still meet our legal obligations to comply. And now we've got a plan change that has greater qualifying matters and more exclusions and recession plans and things. So do you believe that this still complies with the intent of MDRS? Like, are we actually meeting our legal obligation to put something forward that it complies, not just notifying something?
Yeah, Mark will address the legality aspect.
Yeah.
Just quickly touch on your earlier point about the limits of the previous proposal. I guess that's more in reference in terms of what we are enabling rather than what we are restricting. I think if we would have had simply more time with the original proposal, we may very well have ended up with the same proposal we're putting forward with you today. There simply isn't time. There's about 5,000 pages of material just for qualifying matters to justify what we are proposing. It takes an immense amount of work to be able to do what we have done in the short amount of time that's been available. And so it's just a function of time in order to be able to consider further qualifying matters.
Okay.
And to answer your latter question, what we're putting forward is accords with the requirements of the Resource Management Act. We wouldn't be putting it forward to you otherwise. And the evaluation that supports the additional qualifying matters has considered and addressed the requirements in Section 32 of evaluating alternatives, but also the additional requirements for qualifying matters under Section 77JKL.
Good, thank you.
Just to add to what Mark said, there's been internal and external legal advisors all along the way in terms of drafting this plan change.
Great. And based on the deputations today, and we had some talk earlier about transport, and I think there's been a misunderstanding. What I'd quite like to do is propose an amendment that allows development. So at the moment, it's based on the core public transport routes and 10-minute walk to those. And so I've put through wording that also includes MDRS provisions in a 5-minute walking catchment from other public transport routes. So I think you thought it was the other way around when we talked about it at the break. So I've sent those through. But that would mean that there would be small sections on the hills and other areas that aren't covered by core public transport routes but still have a half-hourly service that would still be able to have MDRS provisions, although there's still the sunlight qualifying matter.
So the qualifying matter that's being put forward on public transport accessibility is based on what we've been describing generically as core bus routes.
Yep.
That includes bus routes defined for future investment through the Public Transport Futures business case. It also, staff have identified other routes beyond those subject to future investment where we consider there's a high level of accessibility. Those routes provide strong connections between centres but also between employment areas. So examples are the number 17 between the central city and the employment area in the Russley area, the connection between the airport and the city centre, as well as cross-city connections between Horswell and Belfast. So there are some other routes that we've identified that are captured. In terms of the areas that are subject to bus routes across the city as a whole, ECAN's Environment Canterbury has an extensive network of bus routes which we provide infrastructure to facilitate the use of. That network is extensive in terms of its distribution, and so taking 5-minute catchments from those other bus routes would still capture a vast majority of the city and leave pockets that would raise the question of whether that pocket's appropriate or not. And so if we were to apply that resolution, there's a risk that we're enabling intensification close to all bus routes, which leaves very few parts of the city, but also that those parts excluded may inadvertently be excluded, but still be appropriate for intensification for other reasons.
So did you take into account things like on the hills, for example, Mount Pleasant, where the developer was talking about before? There's a lot of people, older people, who want to stay in their communities, but there are no smaller developments and no places with no large gardens, for example, in their community currently. And we have someone like him who's looking to develop, 15 smaller units, but won't be able to do so. And it's right next to a bus stop. And often older people, they're not time pressed to get to work. A half-hour stop is perfectly acceptable. So why wouldn't we be taking those kind of things into account?
The extent that there's areas of the city where there's services, but frequency may impede accessibility to where people need to go in a timely manner, and we need to draw the line such that a qualifying matter that excludes areas based on public transport accessibility, or should I say the lack thereof, that any qualifying matter needs to be effective in the context of what we're trying to achieve, and to introduce one that applies to all routes. Its effectiveness as a qualifying matter to exclude intensification from those areas, the exclusion zone, if I can call it that, is so limited that it leads to the question of what are we trying to achieve if it covers such a vast area.
So does that mean that actually public transport covers so much of our city already that actually people generally have pretty good access to public transport?
I think you're asking the same question about three different ways,
okay.
perhaps.
So the OARC, so we're down to sort of just a few properties and maybe one that's due for intensification that was part of the regeneration zone and is now privately owned. And we've got some potential wording for an amendment to exclude that from density. Strong objection to people putting, medium density housing in what was our red zone. So there was wording for that, yeah?
So there's staff have investigated and, as Ike explained, proposed a qualifying matter across the majority of the Otakaro Avon River corridor, and there's just the one site or two parcels that are still enabled for intensification, but to a much lesser scale, and that's based on geotechnical evidence that we can use to demonstrate that 6 stories is not appropriate, recognising that site is within a walkable distance of the city centre zone where the MPS otherwise prescribes that we're to enable 6 stories. So the MPS in the context of that site is very directive, we need to provide a qualifying matter to exclude it. If we were to exclude it from intensification entirely, we would need to rely on the basis that the regeneration plan for the Otakara River Corridor defines that site within the green spine, and on the basis that the outcome of the corridor is for open space and publicly accessible routes. That would be the basis, noting that the land is in private ownership and is therefore not fitting within the other qualifying matter that we've applied to the rest of the corridor.
And just to add what Mark's saying, the sites that we're talking about are on the edge of the Otakara River Corridor. There are no regeneration plan features that exist across those sites. They exist on a corner of Harvey Terrace and Fitzgerald Ave, whereby almost the entirety of the rest of Harvey Terrace is enabled to 6 stories. So in terms of continuity of the development form, if you will, within the area, that is in line with what has been proposed for the entirety of that area and doesn't seek to fragment, compartmentalise or otherwise the OARC or compromise development opportunities or enable other development opportunities within the OARC. So we're comfortable with what we have put forward.
Okay. And on the trees, John, you were saying earlier it's only plan change 13 that would really go ahead now. Do the financial contributions for the trees and that stuff go ahead now, or do we have to wait a year for those?
They don't have an immediate legal effect. The financial contributions chapter of the plan change, yep.
So is that likely to incentivise developers to chop down as many trees as possible, as soon as possible, until the plan change is sorted? Because we see this happening already since we decided not to notify in September.
Yeah, I mean, they are entitled to take down trees that are not protected on their property.
So the perverse outcome from the sunlight qualifying matter is that we're likely to have more trees chopped down than would otherwise be the case.
Yeah, I might just get Mark to comment on that about the chopping of the tree, how the financial contributions work.
without the financial contribution kind of aspect and us being able to fund replacements, but yeah.
To add to that, while you're doing that, what can we do to protect those trees?
In the meantime.
Hang on.
In the meantime.
Wait, Sarah, have you finished?
Well, I just need the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tyler was starting off. That's right.
So 2 points to make. One is that the requirements for financial contributions, if you're right, John's correct that they don't take legal effect until decisions are made after the IHP's recommendations. So there is that risk. However, it needs to be looked alongside the fact that the provisions that are enabling of development won't take effect until then as well. So whilst there's a risk that someone chops down the trees in the interim, any proposal for development may not be advanced until the rules take effect in any case. So there is still that risk, as you say, but someone that's proposing a development, multi-use development on a site, multi-unit development on a site, won't be able to rely on the rules in the same way that someone can't be required to pay financial contributions in the meantime.
Yeah, but if they have a site, they're going to chop down the trees. Anyway, thank you.
The other aspect is we have been investigating a plan change to review the schedule of significant trees and to look at a separate plan change to add more trees.
Yeah, but that's only likely to be a few hundred. So, yeah, thanks.
Victoria.
Thank you. Thank you very much for referencing the IHP process. And quoting John Hardy's words, it's the proper process. I think that's really important for everybody to remember that is the next process, the most, the important component of the next step. I want to have a look at the timeline that you put up, which was your second to last slide. I think it was the slide just before the investigator spoke to us. If we can put that up, please. Yep. I can't see specifically in there where the period is for the submitters to speak to their submissions and engage with the panel. Is it intended that they be able to address the panel and speak to those submissions?
That's the October-November period.
Okay, so that's my next question then, is having been involved in a previous IHP process that had very fluid timelines, we've really only got a couple of months there, and this is, as you've heard, people are very passionate about this. We may need more time than that. So how fixed are these dates?
They're not fixed. Obviously, we can look if we need more time. That's something that we will need to explore. We probably won't know that until we
How long is a piece of string?
Yeah, near when the submissions close, and we know what we're dealing with then.
It is, just to add to what John said, we are under an existing direction from the Minister for decisions to be made by August 2023 on the assumption that we notified August last year. So there's an assumption in that Council would go through the process in 12 months. We will need to request from the Minister to give a direction of a date that we can make decisions by, to give certainty of when the process will be completed, and we'll need to give our best estimate of the timeline. The uncertainty comes with the number of submissions, recognising it will be a significant number, but we need to recognise that it's a truncated process and we need to move quickly, and so in requesting a revised date from the Minister, we need to be cognisant of that, and that it's not drawn out for too long a period.
Yeah, and requesting that revised date, I think it could be helpful to include in there some flexibility in the event that we have to go back, just understanding the fluidity of the previous panel. My next question jumps ahead a little bit. Let's say we notify and we get the recommendations from the IHP, and then this council decides not to accept that recommendation. I'd like to understand a little bit more what the next process looks like. Now, you may not be able to comment on it, but I think what I'm trying to get to is, how does the Minister then make a decision? Because I understand it goes back to the Minister. Is the Minister only looking at the evidence, the submissions and the report of the IHP, or is the Minister going to be using other mechanisms, whether it's Mr Hardy's report or some comment from us? I'd just like to understand a little bit more about what that looks like. You may not be able to comment.
Well, I'm not sure it's explicit in the Act how that plays out, except that the Minister has a power if the Council doesn't accept the IHP recommendations. Are you aware of?
Yeah, just to highlight that, that power under the Act is in whole or part. So, for example, an IHP may make several recommendations. They may choose to split it up. It's really up to them, really. And then Council will be required to consider whether or not they accept those individual recommendations. So, if either all or some of those recommendations are rejected by Council, you're right, they will go to the Minister to make his or her decision at that time. Like John said, the Act doesn't stipulate to what level of detail and finesse is made after that point, but I guess I would argue that the Minister really cannot make substantive changes to the proposal after that time, because it would risk re-notification, I would suspect, again. So my guess is that it would be more about whether or not the recommendations put forward by the IHP are suitable in whole or part.
Councillor Henstock, I think the other factor to consider is, because we are much later in the process, we may have actual cases in other authorities where that may happen, and understanding how that has then played out would inform any position that the Council may wish to take.
Thank you. Aaron.
Well, Vic just kind of asked it, but I'll just to clarify for all the people that have come in and submitted, like John said, that the next step in the process, and we always have to get the process right, forget the outcome, but as long as the process is right, we're good. The next step is to go to the independent hearings panel. All these people come in and make submissions and stuff like that. Then what? Like, how much will it change? How much will they be listened to? How much confidence can they have in that process?
So any submitter who's made a submission up until the 3rd of May, they, on the submission form, need to express whether they wish to be heard. Those submitters that express that they wish to be heard will then have the opportunity and be invited by the independent hearings panel to present to that panel. That submitter can prepare a statement before the hearing, which is circulated to parties for the panel to consider in advance. And the panel, upon that submitter appearing at the hearing, the panel can ask that submitter questions, as well as there being the opportunity for cross-examination by other parties if it's deemed appropriate by the panel for that to occur. The panel will then convene and consider both what they've heard from the submitters, but also what's been received from council officers in terms of recommendations. So one point I didn't make is that council officers will need to review all the submissions and make recommendations to the panel based on evidence. And those recommendations will be considered alongside what the panel will have heard during those hearings, as well as the written submissions, and come to a position that then will be written up as their recommendations in a report to the council. It's worth noting that a submitter that chooses not to be heard, someone that doesn't choose to present to the panel, their submission is still live and will be considered by the panel in the same manner as someone that has presented to the panel.
Okay, thank you. Melanie.
Thanks. My question is around the trees and that article that was in the paper the other day about Clyde Road, and you were quoted, John, or wasn't quote, but talking about the obligation or that levy transferring from the developer to new owners. I guess my concern is around developers putting in the trees, which was what we're wanting, but then someone purchasing it and chopping them all down is the phrase we've been using.
Yeah, so that's something we've been thinking about, is how it will work for a subdivision and when there's an obligation to for trees to be provided, and transferring those obligations to a new owner from the subdivider developer.
So how can we ensure that? Or
We can put consent notices on titles, which makes it an obligation for the owner of the property.
so how do we go about making sure that it could happen?
It's just done as part of the course as a resource consent process. So, like John said, we have the legal mechanisms to ensure that there is protections of trees as part of the financial contributions process. And as you point out, that is imperative to continue that there is that retention of tree canopy cover.
Yeah,
So
I was just going to add to that when a subdivision consent comes in, it's issued on the basis of conditions. One of those conditions can be that obligation via consent notice on.
So could we, if this goes through the hearings panel process and then comes back to us and we say yes, then at that point do we put in something into the plan to say that that would have to happen? So that would...
Yeah, that's just a function under the Act that we have that delegation to be able to do that. So.
Okay.
The plan just gets changed. Yep.
Cool. And there was the submission or deputation today around drains and creeks, and that email's come to us from Karen. I was just wondering if you had any comments around that in terms of underlying water structures and how those things are sort of taken into account when developments go through that resource consent process.
Yeah, I guess firstly we have included the existing water body setbacks that are contained within our district plan as a qualifying matter, and water body setbacks for a variety of different reasons, and one of those is potential propensity for flood risk and proximity to those water bodies, and it restricts any development within those setbacks to ensure longevity of occupation on land and things like that. Additional to, as I highlighted earlier, we do have various other controls to proactively manage development to ensure that the stormwater catchment is not unduly compromised. And so there, through the ability of the bylaw, we have flexibility to say, hey look, a catchment is at capacity or otherwise, and we can ad hoc increase the amount of control that we have to have greater protection in terms of stormwater retention on site. And that's, in my view, quite a powerful ability that this council has thanks to those bylaws.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Tim?
Thank you. Following on from that, do we have the ability to say that we're at capacity in this particular area, and so to say no to the development?
Yes, we do that currently. We have a number of instances where resource consent has been granted for, say, multi-unit development. However, building consent is unable to be granted because of lack of sufficiency. And as I said, that happens currently.
And does that also include wastewater?
Yes.
Yep, okay. With regards to, if we go right through to the end of the process and we everything's been approved, gone through the IHP, etc., with where we are at the moment with the RMA, we have developers or whoever wanting to make changes, and so they will try and, with the design, be slightly more than the minimum for setbacks, etc., and they are classed by the Commissioner as minor or less than minor and could be allowed. How will that be with regards to our sunlight setbacks, recession planes, etc., and road setbacks with this new plan? Are they hard fast with regards to sunlight, or will we have this where a developer could come through the RMA process and be heard by a Commissioner, and there could be 100 or 200 mils with regards to minor or less than minor?
Yeah, the latter is true. It is a function of the fact that we operate within an effects-based regime,
Yep.
and so it's enabling the possibility to argue that the effects are, for like you say, less than minor, and a breach can go ahead accordingly, and that's by function of the Act. I guess I would say that there are various thresholds that we have proposed as part of the framework. When it comes to the scale of residential development, any development that is greater than 3 units requires resource consent and requires explicit control and urban design through residential design principles, which we've included as part of this proposal.
But the resource consent process doesn't change. If you breach a rule in the district plan, which these will form a new set of rules, you're entitled to apply for a resource consent and be assessed on the basis of the district plan and RMA requirements.
So so anyone can actually go in with a plan that is slightly more, and so that it's exactly as it is now. So there's been no change to that.
Yep.
Okay. Where we have, you mentioned before in some of the Sydenham, Eddington and Charleston with regards to light industrial, we have issues where we have industrial or light industrial and residential coming up against each other. Where in our plans, and I haven't found it, with regards to, say, the pressure on light industrial, which is an essential part of our city plan, where those new areas could move to? I'm just kind of, will that be looking around?
So within the locations that they are at present, and recognising the change in zoning which enables mixed-use development in the Sydenham area, for instance, we're proposing a rule that requires noise installation of residential activity within a development that is to mitigate the effects of noise from a adjoining light industrial activity. There is other standards, including setbacks and so forth, to manage those effects. In terms of your question about businesses and where they go, we're, as part of our regular three-yearly assessment, we assess the supply of land for business, including industrial and commercial, with further breakdown, for instance, warehousing versus industrial, to consider what is the current availability of land. Is that land suitable for that use? And we compare that with the demand for land, so that the premise behind it is that we ensure that there's always sufficient capacity to accommodate future growth, and that includes capacity to accommodate demand from businesses that may relocate from one side of the city to another. So we're continually monitoring that and review it through spatial planning of defining new locations for where business can go.
Because I mean, historically, if you look at Christchurch, the light industrial has been on the east and the south, which is Sydenham, Charleston, etc. And there's a reason for that. And I think that it's just, it seems the reasoning has been lost because of the want of residential in those areas. So I'll just bring that up, just a thought. You also made 2 comments with regards to, and it'd be good to, just for the public to understand, the term what we can influence and evidence. So it's not like you've just gone off and decided, oh, this is what we're going to do. So could you just explain the process with regards to evidence to support? And just, Lucy, I think it's important for the public to know that there has been a lot of work done on these, and to present that to or character area or whatever.
Yeah, I guess as part of submissions on the plan change, like you say, they need to be supported by evidence. The nature and the scale or otherwise of said evidence very much depends on what the alternative is being proposed through the submission. I guess is to simplify it, the more evidence that is provided in support of the submission, the greater the chances are that the IHP will be open to considering any alternatives to give effect to that submission.
And just breaking it down, the Act prescribes a number of requirements for anyone putting forward a qualifying matter, and it has been considered through our work, including what effect the qualifying matter has in terms of reducing capacity. So how many houses potentially could be, what capacity would be reduced by on any site. We're also to consider options to maximise density and height to the extent possible, and thirdly to assess on a site-by-site basis what impact it has. So those requirements are over and above what would have been required before this legislation, and as a consequence has required us to revisit not just consider those tests in the context of new qualifying matters, but also tests those matters in the current district plan and whether they stack up as a basis for a qualifying matter.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Sam, you have a go.
Yeah, thank you. Just one really quick one, and it may be for Brent potentially. It was just around the comments Anne Dingwall made when she made her presentation around, I think it was section 31 of the RMA and the purpose around it. Did you get those comments at the? Yeah, have you got any view on that?
No, I mean, in our view, we have, as we said, reiterated earlier, met the requirements of the Act, section 32 of the Act, and we've provided evaluation reports as part of the proposal in the package that's included in the agenda.
Right, so it lines up with sort of the purpose of the Act and things like that.
Just the one point I guess to highlight is that in terms of objectives and policies that are mentioned, the MDRS inserts objectives and policies, which is a bit of a game changer, to be completely honest, in terms of the standard plan change process, so that changes the 32 process in terms of evaluation of those objectives and policies.
Okay, thank you. That's
and lastly, Tyler, and then Yanni, and then Sarah.
Yeah, sorry, this is a big Riccarton one. Connecting back to the master plan that you were talking about before, one of the major issues in Riccarton is around character, or the perception of character, which defines a signature trait of said neighbourhoods or wards. One of the hesitancies that residents have is around losing that character, particularly around the major densification of Riccarton itself. What measures have we put in around the aesthetic nature of our neighbourhoods in any of our plans that council has? And if not, is there anything we can do to contribute to ensuring that the character is retained after or if we notify PC14?
Yeah, so in terms of character areas, we have proposed to carry over the vast majority of existing character areas that are contained in the current district plan. We've also added to those in a variety of different areas. I believe 3 or 4 different additional character areas have also been added. In the order of about 3,000 residential parcels are now proposed to be under a character area overlay, and there are far more directive specific restrictive controls for development within those areas to ensure that character is maintained. In terms of additional controls beyond that, the restrictions that we have of that are very, very limited, because MDRS sets density standards in terms of the building setbacks, bulk, so on and so forth, and we can only insert additional controls that do not compromise or seek to repeat or otherwise those density standards. And so if we wanted to do that, we'd have to identify it as a qualifying matter, which would mean that we'd have to, expand character areas and the like as well. The work that we have done has very much highlighted, in our view, the limits of really what we are comfortable with for character areas in terms of meeting the requirements under the Act. And I guess it's worthwhile to highlight that the standard, the evidence basis that is set has very much changed as a result of the Enabling Housing Act through the requirements of meeting the standards for qualifying matters. And so there aren't any other specific controls or area-specific controls that seek to reflect, let's say, for example, suburban character, other than those character areas that we've identified as part of the qualifying matter.
Sure, I completely understand.
I was just going to add to what Ike said. If intensification is permitted in those in particular areas, it will start to change the nature of those areas where there is multi-unit developments coming in. So that is sort of an inevitable consequence of intensification.
Of course. The angle I guess I'm sort of going at isn't necessarily around the qualifying matters, because they're set, and the Rickett and Bush was able to get a qualifying matter across, which was great. But I'm more thinking about neighbourhoods that are definitive. Let's talk about, for example, Eyre Street in Riccarton. It has a certain look and feel to it.
Yep.
The same thing goes for Picton Ave, which is the opposite end. It's probably one of the worst designed streets, or not designed, but worst, aesthetically it's not a good looking street, based around the kinds of houses that are there, which include the green space or the lack thereof because people want to park on the berms. So I'm just trying to think about protecting Riccarton around the new intensification that comes across. Are we able to put in measures that will define a certain character that is driven by public interest, if you will?
So defining that there's areas that we've, as I explained, that have represent a certain character and they're identified as character areas, and we've assessed other areas that are not defined as character areas but evaluated them on the merit of them being character areas and concluded they're not.
Of course.
It doesn't preclude submissions seeking that new areas be character areas, but going back to your question about defining a certain character or outcome, there's probably a couple of things. The national policy statement is quite clear in saying that the current amenity that exists in a place shouldn't be seen as not changing, and that amenity will evolve over time, including character.
I think I'm not being clear. I'm really sorry. I apologise. I'm looking at the master plans now, like the Edgware Village Master Plan, Fero Master Plan, Linwood Village Master Plan. They all have a definitive trait. So what I'm saying is there are baselines that the council has currently, because I know we're going to get intensified. That's absolutely fine where it stands, and we know that. That's going to go across to the hearings, but I'm just talking about baseline design standards that define these certain neighbourhoods. Is there some at the moment where they stand?
Yeah, the short answer is no, and there's quite a simple answer for that, and that is because MDRS is the baseline.
Okay.
Upon notification, what is existing in terms of operative controls and so on and so forth is superseded by density standards set by MDRS. So the baseline that you're referring to, upon notification and through this process and as a function of the Act, is wholeheartedly different.
I see.
Just final point is through the Otatahi Christchurch plan, we're looking at a program that follows on from that of local area planning, and that local area planning you can draw some comparison with the suburban centre master planning program that occurred post-earthquake, whereby we start to define what is the outcomes we want for those areas and look at spaces in an integrated way, rather than just looking at the street in terms of whether car parking should be provided or not. We look at the street as a whole and consider what sort of environment do we want along that street in terms of tree planting, in terms of space.
That's exactly what I'm after. Exactly what I'm after.
So, because the Eyre Street example you used and the other example is tree planting is a big difference in those two areas. Yeah.
Which we need a lot. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Yanni, your turn, mate.
Thank you. I'm just looking at like one of the maps, and it's quite hard for people to understand. Like you've got the yellow, and then is this light yellow or is this orange? or is it dark orange? Or I mean,
So the maps that have been provided are not the maps that will be made public upon notification. When we notify, there will be a fully interactive, searchable, all the rest of the bells and whistles mapping system that exists.
Yeah. So
The purpose of today is to seek notification, to seek submissions on a proposal, and to have all information available once we notify.
yeah. So just from a simple point of view, is the yellow on here or the orange? Which one's the higher density?
I believe it's the orange.
It's a bit hard to tell from here. Yeah.
That's Boston.
So that's medium.
Residential, suburban, medium, and high.
So that dark orange is high, medium, and low.
Okay. So what's the height limit for the yellow?
Yanni, sit down so everyone can hear you, mate.
Sorry. So I'm just trying to understand what the height limit is for the yellow and what the height limit is for the orange.
The orange is MDRS, so that's 12 metres, because that's the medium density zone.
Yeah.
And then the yellow that you've got there, I believe is the suburban, so it's
Yeah,
8 metres, 2 stories.
Eight for the bright yellow, and for that paler orange, which dominates the rest of the map, it's 12.
Right. And that, in terms of what it currently would be in those areas, would be how much of an increase?
In broad terms, it's 8 metres across most of that area.
Right. So I guess
Good answer.
So some areas there'll be a transition between suburban and medium density areas, which will be 11.
And the reason for just trying to understand what was happening in that area is of concern to me is that that's in an area where we've had to buy up properties because of flooding. So when I look at the map, what I can't understand is why we would enable more development in a flood-prone area that we've had to spend ratepayer dollars buying up properties because of the flood risk. And I just struggling to understand the logic behind having that shown.
Yeah, the mapping that's shown doesn't show qualifying matters. It's only zoning that you've shown. And so you can't see the layers that are there for high risk flooding areas that's there. So I'd turn your mind to looking at the maps that show the qualifying matters that will show flooding areas as well.
So this is more illustrative than specific at this point,
That's right.
yes?
Yes.
So, but would we not want to actually have the lowest possible form of intensification in areas that we've actually seen huge flood risk or flood damage?
That's what is proposed by way of qualifying matter.
Yeah, so the overlays control nuance in terms of the zone outcomes. The zone itself does not control the zone outcomes in terms of height. So overlays would reduce it down or restrict it entirely.
So, for instance, in a high flood hazard management area, it's non-complying to subdivide or to establish a new building on a site. So there are significant restrictions on development where there's a high flood risk.
So the officers have clearly answered the question.
Yeah, in terms of the Avon River corridor, my understanding is we have...
It's a qualifying matter. Avon River corridor is a qualifying matter, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah, so the underlying zoning will still be there. You'll just have it. You've just got a specific one. So did we think about doing, like a qualifying matter map of the Apawaho Heathcote, since we've done it for the Otakaro Avon?
The interactive mapping that I described, which will be published on the 17th and allows you to search by property, will show both the qualifying matters, the zoning, and there'll be pop-up boxes to explain the effect of those different layers.
Yeah, sorry, I guess my question wasn't clear enough. We've put a specific overlay over the Avon Otakaro, which I understand. I'm happy to support Sarah's amendment to include the dwellings that are going to be intensified, but did we consider doing the same thing for the Apawaho Heathcote River?
Short answer is no, because it's not necessary. The only reason why we've considered the OARC is because it's within a walkable catchment of the central city, so we're required to use it as a qualifying matter. Any other open space area or alike isn't a relevant residential zone, so no intensification is enabled as part of this process or proposed.
So they've answered the question and said no. Right.
Okay. Can I just check?
Yanni, how many more you've got, bud?
Oh, just a few less than Sarah. So, yeah. Okay.
It gets dark. Just remind members it actually gets dark at 9 o'clock.
Yeah. So, I just wanted to check, because I've read through the Section 32 assessment, and we heard from submitters that the poor, the renters and the students' voices had been forgotten. And I just wanted to check in the assessment, because I can't find any sort of social impact assessment around where the most vulnerable and the poor's views in terms of the impact has been taken into account. I've seen the assessment around housing affordability, and there is kind of a general reference to this plan change not delivering any significant increase in addressing the issue of housing affordability. But in terms of the social impact that we've heard from submitters, both some of the ones at the start and then obviously the one right at the end, where is that assessment around the social impact of the intensification, particularly in the lower socioeconomic areas of the city?
So the Section 32 report incorporates an evaluation of impacts in terms of social, environmental, economic and cultural. It's not, the Section 32 is not divided up into sections of social being in one section. It's integrated throughout. But what I would add is that the council has a resolution from the 8th of September meeting when it directed staff, resolved that staff investigate by completion of a social impact assessment what the social effects are of intensification, and then we consider both methods through this plan change but also outside of this plan change what can be done to address those and to report back to council. The resolution also sought that staff investigate and consider those social impacts through evidence to the hearings panel. So that resolution we're not proposing is revoked and it still stands for the purpose of this plan change.
Yanni, I think we've done you've pretty good questions, and I think you might have done them to death.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the other question I had was in terms of the land value, because I'm kind of keen to understand, you've rezoned some land industrial into mixed residential, and I presume that we've done some sort of assessment about what the increase in value to land that will do if it's turned into residential. So do we have any sense of what value we've added if we rezone it, and what we do to capture that value going back into things like social and affordable housing?
But rezoning land is just life. If you've got something and it used to be on the fringe of town and now town has grown out and it's taken over from it, it gets rezoned and that's life. So that's all that's happening. It's just the way it is.
So the rezoning of areas to mixed use, we have had some economic evaluation of that rezoning. I don't have the details to hand, but the change in zoning that's occurred there, that inevitably will lead to some value uplift, but there's other changes through this plan change. For instance, the extensive rezoning of suburban areas to medium density may also lead to value uplift by providing greater enablement of development on any site. So it's not limited to the rezoning to mixed use.
Sorry, just so I'm clear though, there is an assessment around the value uplift that's created by the upzoning, and can we just make that really clear so we can see it?
As part of the Section 32 report, there's an economic assessment attached to that, but I can't describe the detail around how much it goes into value uplift at this point without reference to it.
Yeah, and just the final question from me is
final.
So sorry, there's two. There's one process question that I'll leave right at the end, but just in terms of the specifics.
Final question, Yanni. Come on.
Yeah,
mate.
in terms of the specifics. In terms of, like, when I read through all the documents, there's a assessment from the Littleton Port Company seeking a whole bunch of changes in terms of the critical infrastructure that's in a port, and it's quite hard to kind of follow. Initially, I understood that we couldn't make changes to industrial zones, but actually what we've seen is that there's a whole bunch of port activity that happens through a lot of the industrial residential areas that are adjacent that doesn't seem to be controlled. So can anyone just kind of help me understand what the port's submission is seeking and what they've got in terms of restricting development, in terms of reverse sensitivity, and if you've actually assessed that to other port-related activities?
I believe you're referencing the port interface area. It has another title quite think of it right now, but that is an existing overlay that exists within the district plan at the moment, and it is effectively a control within Littleton in an area that interfaces that, similar to what we're proposing with a residential industrial interface, to ensure that there isn't an undue exposure in terms of noise effects, vibrations, so on and so forth from port activities. I guess in terms of wider effects of, say, for example, transit, that would broadly be captured in terms of noise controls from adjacent to various roading activities.
I'll just be more specific.
Well. Hang on. And then we also have proposed to introduce the industrial residential interface as well. And so all of those areas where there are the port that they use, industrial areas, will also be captured by proxy with those areas as well.
Thank you, great answer. Thank you, Sarah.
Oh, sorry. Can I just ask the process question? So in terms of the... No, I said I had, and then I had one process one. So we've heard around the process around the Greater Christchurch spatial plan. So did anyone, because it seems sort of back to front that we would do the specifics before we've done the Greater Christchurch plan, given that we've just released the Greater Christchurch plan for consultation and we're going through a public engagement process at the moment. Has anyone approached the Minister or the representatives of the Crown to suggest that we would actually do that process first to inform this plan change?
Do you mind if I answer that, gentleman?
Cool.
Councillor, I'm sure you fully appreciate that we are already delayed in terms of the statutory duties that we are responsible for as a local authority because of the decision that was made by councillors in September. The reality is the timeline is the timeline, and we cannot go back and ask again for another extension. We have to parallel run this work, and that is the reality that we are having to live with. So it's not relevant for officers to comment on that.
So, Sarah's question, please.
Thanks. Just checking back, because one of the things I really liked about the previous proposed one was the upzoning from sort of that light industrial to mixed use between Morehouse and Brougham, and I know a lot of work's been done to work out how that will do. When I look at the map that was linked in our documents and those kind of things, it's got it zoned as commercial. Is there a different map I'm supposed to be looking at, or this one here?
So there's several different zones there. There's the commercial zone that applies along Colombo Street, either side of Colombo Street, and then out from that is a mixed-use zone. That mixed-use zone currently sits in the commercial chapter.
Okay.
It's known as, at the present time, it's known as a commercial.
So the map, it's not as detailed as the maps that go out will be, but that's still there. The upzoning is still there. That's in right. That space. Just checking. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Dawn will... You're within striking. Dawn would just like to have a few words.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to publicly commend Mark, Ike and John for the depth of response that you have received today, the quality, knowledge and experience that you have heard, and the fact of the professionalism in which they have worked really hard to take on board the very significant concerns of residents and the views that you have expressed from September through to today in terms of dealing with what is undoubtedly a really difficult issue. And I'm extremely proud of the three of you and the team behind you. Thank you. Okay, so now we'll move on to amendments. Councillors have had an opportunity to send amendments through in advance. If there are any amendments raised today, we may need to give staff time to prepare for these if they're too technical. But we have three. Yep, 3 amendments. Which are on screen.
Yep, there they go.
No, there were ones I'd kind of sent through. I think I'm only going to do the bottom one. I don't need the top 2.
So
just the public transport access.
So we're getting rid
there
of
were ones we got wording for, but we'd had additional advice with me
okay.
with it, which meant that I didn't want to do them. Yeah,
okay.
That's fine.
Thank you. So we've got this one here. Sarah, do you want to address it, or have you got a seconder? Celeste, thank you.
You just want me to talk to it? Mm-hmm. Am I doing my whole debate or just talking to this bit?
No,
just the amendment?
Just sort of
okay.
present it, sort of, kind of.
So, having public transport access limited to the core routes only and not other public transport route means that across the city there will be areas where, because we haven't zoned for greater density, ECAN will never put in more public transport. And the people who live in those areas will never be able to access good public transport because ECAN will always say you don't have enough people living there to justify it. It's a chicken and egg situation, and I think that this is an area where we need to take a more leadership role. And I would like to think that my colleagues who are, keen on public transport would support this. I think that not a whole 10-minute walk, but a 5-minute walk from other transport routes is appropriate, and will mean that ECAN won't have any excuses not to put in public transport in areas that we know need it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So, what do we do? Questions here or just go and debate?
I think I just need to check if there's any additional officer advice in relation to the matter that Sarah has raised.
Sorry, can you repeat
So
that?
have you got any additional officer advice to what Sarah's just raised, please?
I think we do.
Yeah, I guess if I can start. One of the fundamental outcomes of what we proposed as part of this package, focusing on 10 minutes from the core routes and the other routes that connect core centres, is that at the end of the day there is a finite supply of medium density, high density intensification. We want to ensure that's within the right areas. We want to ensure that we're not increasing propensity for private vehicle use and increasing our emissions as a city, amongst many other things, in terms of benefits of further restricting development. If we extend that further, firstly, we are enabling it within areas where there is a lower frequency, a lower propensity as a result of that. And while in the future further considerations for public accessibility to public transport may be considered by regional council, I would hazard a guess that increasing it to higher frequency, whereby propensity increases for all routes, is fairly limited. In the very short amount of time that we've had to consider this alternative resolution, we have also looked at what it looks like spatially in terms of 400 metres, as in 5 minutes, from those other routes. And like Mark alluded to earlier on, I would guess that it would still cover 90% of the urban residential area. And so whereas we would be limiting through our proposal about a third of the outer suburban areas, if we were to go down this path, we would be maybe limiting 10%, if that.
Thank you very much.
And the ones that are left are quite fragmented and not joined up either.
Beautiful. Is there any other questions on this matter? Keep it on topic towards this amendment. Sam has one. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just sort of noting, I guess, the extensive briefings we've had and the work we've done as a council. Is it something that someone could raise that through the IHP process?
I certainly, based on the recommended plan change, which includes that qualifier matter on public transport accessibility, I'm very confident that there'll be a submission on it, which would then give scope for further consideration.
Yeah, so if it lost here, it could still go through based on submissions through the IHP. So it would be considered by the IHP if people submitted on it. Yeah.
I'm very confident on that.
No, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll now go into debate on this amendment because we only have one and we've all got 3 minutes each, as we don't want to use. So does anyone want to have any debate on this, or do you want me to put this amendment? Put it? Yanni, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think the better process for this is, given that it could have a significant impact on what the staff have worked on, and we don't have all that information, we just had some very general advice. I think it's better that this goes through the IHP process if this goes notified. I just know from my experience representing an area like Linwood and Bromley, where trying to get bus services from ECAN, who basically cut the bus services in the poorest areas of the city and put them into the more affluent areas, has been pretty frustrating. So I would really like to see a lot more detail and social impact assessment on this before we agreed to it, because I think just they can't even provide buses at the moment to the port on the Littleton route to meet the demand of people. I'd be very hesitant about expecting them to provide a whole bunch more bus services based on this amendment.
Okay, thank you. So I will just, yep, fine, yep.
Yeah, I think because this is a chicken and egg situation and this plan is going to set the direction of the city for the next 50 to 100 years, I think ECAN, as things develop over time, will have more than enough time to find additional bus drivers and buses and things to put on these routes. I'd also like to note that actually there are areas that are excluded from the density because of a lack of public transport access in the current proposed one in Bromley and Linwood. And so ECAN will now not be able to justify putting buses on in those areas because of a lack of density. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Now I will rush forward and put this motion. All those in favour of the amendment, please say aye. Aye. Those against? No. That is lost. Thank you. So, now...
Could we just show who's in favour, please? Could you just put your hands up so we can see? So that's Councillor Donovan, Councillor Templeton, Councillor Fields. Okay, thank you.